by the morality of their fellow creatures, or indeed by the laws of their country, because there is no legislation written by any person of any time that could even count one iota against the dictates of the supernatural creator of the universe, access to whose precise and exacting will is, of course, only a delusion when it's somebody else's God, when it's the wrong God. If that's not the case, then not only is this belief in God and access to his will not delusionary, but now, I'm told, is actual and seemingly inexplicable suffering is embedded into the very mechanism by which, I'm told, God decided to create human beings. I'm not saying this can't be explained on theism. Of course I can't say that. You could say that this is all part of some grand plan of Jobian proportion in its unintelligibility. Maybe there's some kind of compensation in the afterlife. Maybe dogs do go to heaven after all, sure. I'm just asking you what you would actually expect to be the case. I think that we wouldn't expect Zechariah. It seems that the president of Russia appeared in a nightmare to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and also endowed her with a skill that I'm unable of, which is to adopt a belief simply because of its political or existential convenience. And again, perhaps my desire for my philosophical convictions to be, true is just too high a margin to demand. What I really want to ask is whether this should be any kind of surprise, this approach, I mean. There is some, but it is exactly that kind of thinking, the seeking of agency and design where there is in fact none, that I've traveled here in an attempt to dispel. We've heard a lot about arguments, but as a psychological phenomenon, I wonder how relevant these really are to God belief. That is, when you hear somebody recounting a conversion story, how often does it really begin with premise one? You're more likely to hear a narrative or a story, some kind of account of an experience. Indeed, the most high-profile conversion, perhaps of this millennium, happened just a few weeks ago when the fifth horsewoman of new atheism, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, announced in a long and celebrated essay that she had embraced Christianity. I was far from the first reviewer to notice something rather peculiar about this publication. That is, its somewhat conspicuous lack of arguments for the existence of God or for the truth of Christianity. Instead, she devoted the entire thing to talking about culture. She talked about the looming threats of Russia and China, of global Islamism, of wokeism. I think that an essay which mentions Osama bin Laden, Vladimir Putin, and indeed Professor Richard Dawkins exactly as many times as it mentions Jesus Christ might tell us that we're looking at a conversion that is at best insensitive to the truth claims of religious belief, and instead an attempt to escape, or a result, I should say, of a desire to escape certain unfortunate social realities. That is where God appeared in a dream to Joseph or to Zechariah. It seems that the president of Russia appeared in a nightmare to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and also endowed her with a skill that I'm unable of, which is to adopt a belief simply because of its political or existential convenience. And again, perhaps my desire for my philosophical convictions to be, true is just too high a margin to demand. What I really want to ask is whether this should be any kind of surprise, this approach, I mean. There is some recognition, even amongst the religious, that this is, at least in part, what religion does, what religion is. It provides some kind of unifying ethic to suppress the more depraved elements of our human nature. Evelyn Waugh was once asked how he reconciled his private hedonism and gluttony. He was accused of being rude and self-indulgent, how he reconciles this with his professed Christianity. He accepted the charge and simply said, "Can you imagine how much worse I would be if I wasn't a Catholic?" Fair enough. I think that I'm far from the first to suggest that religion is, in essence, nothing more than a mimetic entity that serves some kind of social purpose like this, that's what it's for, but isn't actually true. And I'm glad to hear that at least one member of the opposition this evening seems to...
Alex O'Connor opens by questioning whether arguments really matter to belief in God. Conversions rarely begin with syllogisms. They begin with fear, crisis, or cultural pressure. Psychologists like Pascal Boyer show that belief often springs from our instinct to see agency where none exists. That is the soil in which faith grows. He points to Ayaan Hirsi Ali's much-discussed conversion. Her essay did not defend the resurrection or the divinity of Christ. It spoke instead of Russia, China, Islamism, and wokeism. Jesus was mentioned as often as Vladimir Putin. This was not a case for truth, but a political diagnosis dressed up as religion. Historically, this is familiar. Faith thrives in instability, not because it proves anything, but because it offers order when society feels under threat. Even believers admit this. Evelyn Waugh, challenged over his vices, replied not that Catholicism made him good, but that it stopped him being worse. That is utility, not revelation. From Constantine's Rome to modern states, rulers leaned on religion for control. Surveys show faith grows where insecurity is greatest. So the question remains, if belief is chosen for stability, not truth, can we call it faith?
I won't say that I know this is the case. Of course, I can't do so. I will simply ask a question of you. What would you expect to see if God existed and all of this was being supervised? What would you expect the world to look like? How would you expect life to have evolved? And if we assume the alternative hypothesis, that is atheism, materialism, that is that the world we find ourselves in is just an amoral arena of accidentally existing organisms competing in an endless struggle for survival, what would we expect to find? And what do we find? A system of natural selection which explains the origin of species on planet Earth, that does not just cause or bring about, but relies upon suffering and death. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and destruction of the unfit. 99% plus of all of the species, let alone animals, that have ever inhabited this planet have been brutally wiped from existence. And for what? For our development? It seems that unimaginable, indescribable, and seemingly inexplicable suffering is embedded into the very mechanism by which I'm told God decided to create human beings. I'm not saying this can't be explained on theism. Of course I can't say that. You could say that this is all part of some grand plan of Jobian proportion in its unintelligibility. Maybe there's some kind of compensation in the afterlife. Maybe dogs do go to heaven after all, sure. I'm just asking you what you would actually expect to be the case. I think that we wouldn't expect to see anything like what I've just described if we assume that there is a benevolent invigilator overseeing the process. However, if we assume atheism, not only do we come to explain this phenomenon, but in my view, we also come to expect it.
Alex O'Connor asks the House to confront a basic question. If the universe was designed and supervised by a loving God, what would we expect to see? A world shaped by care, mercy, or balance. But the world we actually inhabit tells a different story. One built on waste, violence, and extinction. The numbers are stark. More than 99% of all species that have ever lived are gone. Entire branches of life were wiped out long before humans appeared, not by moral failure, but by starvation, predation, or catastrophe. The fossil record preserves scenes of unimaginable brutality, parasites frozen in amber feeding on their hosts, mass graves of animals starved or drowned, whole ecosystems obliterated overnight. Natural selection, the engine of life, does not merely allow suffering, it requires it. The strong live because the weak perish and the cycle never ends. This is not a marginal issue. It is the very mechanism through which life develops. The Permian-Triassic extinction killed almost 90% of marine species. The Cretaceous extinction erased the dinosaurs. Countless smaller die-offs litter the timeline of Earth. Evolution is written in the language of death, and every living thing exists because others did not survive. To call this a grand design is to say that cruelty itself was chosen as the instrument of creation, baked into the process from the very beginning. Believers may appeal to mystery, arguing that such suffering is part of a divine plan beyond human understanding, or that compensation awaits in another life. But mystery is not evidence. Job was told his suffering had no explanation he could grasp. Today, we are told the same, even as data shows that predation, parasitism, genetic disease, and natural disaster are not errors but central features of the system. And if suffering is somehow necessary, then God must be responsible for designing necessity itself. Historically, theologians have wrestled with this problem of evil for centuries, from Augustine's attempt to pin suffering on human sin to Leibniz's claim that this is the best of all possible worlds. Yet both collapse under the evidence of natural history, which makes clear that agony long predates human beings. Predation existed hundreds of millions of years before Adam and Eve were imagined. The struggle for survival was not punishment, it was nature. Philosophers like David Hume saw this clearly, arguing that a world designed by benevolence would not require hurricanes, parasites, and famine to sustain itself. Even Darwin himself described natural selection as a process marked by endless suffering, writing of nature as a battlefield where famine and death were constant forces shaping life. O'Connor leaves the chamber with this challenge. When the structure of life is built on extinction, agony, and relentless competition, can we honestly say it points to divine benevolence? Or is it time to recognize that the universe we see is not supervised with care, but indifferent to suffering from the very beginning?
However, if the truth of theism is indeed as plain and graspable as many on the opposition would doubtless like to suggest this evening, then I must ask why religious belief has traditionally, if not essentially delusional in essence, relied so heavily on, if you like, non-rational modes of convincing. A sign as sure as they come of delusional belief is an inability to muster and a resistance against rational defense of that belief, especially in the face of challenge, and most evident when the threat or enforcement, indeed, of suppression or physical violence is substituted in its place. That is the place of rational argument. And this hardly needs explication. Just 600 feet from the door of this chamber, there's an easily missable cross on the floor of Broad Street, which marks the spot where 3 bishops of the Church of England were burned at the stake. Not even for being the wrong religion, but so close, the wrong denomination, the wrong interpretation of the words. Doctrinal disputes like this have a long and violent history within the religious tradition, and I think it's worth asking why that's the case. Oh, you think that the Son proceeds from the Father alone, not the Father and the Holy Spirit? Oh, you're about to find out as you meet your Maker. Wherever religious authorities have had the political power to do so, I would say, and found the threat of otherworldly hellfire to have somewhat lost its efficacy on certain people, then they provide, shall we say, a corporeal simulacrum of this, bringing the flames into our own vale of tears, providing a very worldly inferno to ready the heretic for the inferno that's to come in Hades, reducing heretics to literal ashes, in the full view of anybody else who might have the temerity to question or to challenge the authority and compassion of the church. Why might a religious tradition, which I'm told is balanced upon reason and provability, evolve such a knee-jerk mortal resistance to freedom of thought? Of course, in our modern age, where the state is no longer the principal auxiliary of religious violence, I of course understand that that's the case. This is something that happened hundreds of years ago. Now that ignoble mantle is taken up instead by individual religious fanatics who cannot and will not be deterred by the morality of their fellow creatures or, indeed, by the laws of their country, because there is no legislation written by any person of any time that could even count one iota against the dictates of the supernatural creator of the universe, access to whose precise and exacting will is, of course, only a delusion when it's somebody else's God, when it's the wrong God. If that's not the case, then not only is this belief in God and access to his will not delusionary, but now, I'm told, is actually a prerequisite for reason, for science, for morality, all of the noble pursuits that humanity entertains. This despite the fact that most of the important developments historically in all of these areas have regularly been made by dissidents who subverted the clerical authoritarianism of the very religious traditions that now wish to claim these developments as their own. Touch scandalous, I think you'll agree. I hope you'll agree, I should say. Again, I can simply ask you what best explains this psychological condition. Might this suppressive and censorial historical attitude, which seems essentially tied to the history of religious thought, be compatible with the truth of religious claims? Of course, absolutely. Is it better explained by an inability to provide serious and conclusive rational defenses of those beliefs? Maybe. Might this also explain the characteristic taboo on the criticism of people's religious belief that survives with us in many ways to this day? Perhaps also, I'm not sure. Might this also explain why faith, as we've already heard, that is, belief without evidence, just reflect on that for a moment, might it also explain why this is proposed as a virtue, and indeed the foundation of belief in God. Blessed, after all, are those who believe without seeing. I don't know. It's not really for someone like myself.
Alex O'Connor makes a sharp point, and history backs him up. He asks why, if religious belief is grounded in reason, it has so often been defended through suppression and violence instead of argument. The record is clear. In Oxford, a small cross on Broad Street marks where 3 bishops were burned in 1555, not for rejecting Christianity, but for following the wrong version of it. Across Europe, thousands more were executed in the name of orthodoxy. The Spanish Inquisition put tens of thousands to death. The 30 Years' War, rooted in sectarian conflict, killed an estimated 8 million people. These were not debates won with reason. They were silenced with fire and steel, leaving generations fearful of questioning authority or exploring forbidden ideas that threatened power. Alex reminds us this pattern continued for centuries. Galileo was threatened for teaching that the Earth moved around the sun. Giordano Bruno was burned alive for imagining an infinite universe. Spinoza was excommunicated for challenging Scripture. Again and again, progress came from those who dared to think against the institutions of faith, not because of them, and often at immense personal risk to reputation, freedom, and life itself. And while states no longer burn heretics, the impulse remains. Religious extremists still justify violence with appeals to divine will, convinced that no human law can override their God. History shows this is not an accident. It is the consistent result of a system that elevates obedience over evidence and treats questioning as a crime against the sacred order. O'Connor's question cuts deep. If faith without evidence is praised as virtue, what does that say about a tradition that has always punished those who try to see more clearly and think more freely? What do you think? Is religion essential for morality, or can ethics and compassion stand firmly on their own? Share your perspective in the comments, and if this sparked new ideas, remember to like, subscribe, and share to keep the discussion alive.
You need to know. The classical, Thomist philosophers will say that God is being itself. God is just being. What the hell does it mean to say that being doesn't exist? What does that even mean? It's like a contradiction.
Because the idea of a judgmental God, a punishing God, a God that is scowling and looking down on us and keeping little marks of what we've done wrong, and that if someone sins or errs, they're going to be cast out or punished or smited or sent to hell or something like that, becomes preposterous.
If people don't understand that so much of what they believe is actually a result of how integrating those beliefs makes you behave and makes you feel, if people think that they're acting purely rationally, that every single decision they make about their worldview and their opinions about the world are purely sort of analytical, syllogistic reasoning, then I think they're either telling the truth, in which case they're missing something incredibly important about the human experience, or they don't realize just how much their emotional states are creeping into their rational thought.
You are infamously began your career on the internet as a new atheist firebrand, kind of the youngest of the lot. And at the same time, you seem to have a almost religious fervor for the Bible and Christianity. What is it that obsesses you about the Bible and the Christian mythology?
The Christians will tell you it's the Christian equivalent of what the Muslims call fitra, the sort of inherent desire or drive that a person is born with towards God, and that I'm being sort of whispered to and through the Scripture. I don't think it's that, partly because I'm so critical of the text. It is the only ancient text with which I have enough familiarity to talk about meaningfully. Some people get obsessed with the Odyssey or the Metamorphoses or something, and I think part of the interest is, can we be sure that Homer wrote this? Can we figure out why? Can we figure out how people interpreted the story at the time? Did the Greeks really believe in the existence of their gods? These are interesting questions, but questions that I don't really have anything to say about because I don't know their stories very well. With the Bible, I spent so long in the new atheist school of thinking that religion is harmful and definitely untrue that I learned a thing or two about the Bible.
But even, I would say, more than that, you studied theology.
That's true.
So that's taking a big step other than becoming vaguely familiar with the Gospels.
But there's an
there's a level to which, when you are in the new atheist sort of firebrand spirit, you think, okay, I'm going to learn about this religion because I want to have better discussions and better debates. And then something shifts, and I'm like, look, it's so simplistic to say religion is bad. I think saying religion is bad is like saying politics is bad. Kind of makes sense, and you could make some case. You could give some grand speech saying politics, it drives families apart. And can you name one war that wasn't caused by politics? It's so terrible. And that's kind of true, but it seems trivially true. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a correct political position. And it doesn't mean that you should abstain from doing politics.
Or that humanity needs politics to a certain level, to a certain degree. Exactly. We have to govern, and we have to find discourse and ways to legislate.
So I think it's pretty naive. And then I'm left in a position where I no longer think I can make this surface level simplistic firebrand atheist case, but I also am now just really interested in the Gospels. Because once you've spent so long learning about this kind of stuff, when somebody comes along and says, hey, have you ever noticed this about the text? It just is interesting to me, because this is something that I've known about for years, and here's something new that I'm discovering. So I just fell into this. I don't know. The only way I can describe it is a bit like how people get interested in all kinds of texts. People have their favorite play or something like that.
I'm going to push back a little bit. Sure. I find that a little disingenuous that you're saying the reason I'm interested in the Gospels is it's the thing I'm the most familiar with. I could be familiar with, the work of,
In fairness, there aren't like
Zarathustra or the Epic of Gilgamesh or something, but
there aren't world religions that have sprung up that are as relevant to the people I interact with today around something like the.
So there's a certain level of relevance to it as well.
Mm-hmm. Because also, I do philosophy more broadly. I talk about ethics. I talk about free will. I talk about all of this kind of stuff. And in doing that, people always come to the table with religion. It always comes up. You're talking about the big questions with people. Around half of them are probably going to be religious, and some of them are going to be Christian. And I just find these conversations so interesting.
It's fascinating talking about this with you. Really, I'm truly fascinated, and I love getting a non-Christian's perspective on the gospel, because I try and dive in occasionally on my own and understand it, and it's so difficult to separate it from canon.
And please take my words with a pinch of salt.
Sure.
Your listeners should, if I've said something that's an egregious error, don't blame Rain. I'm just a guy. I'm just an atheist.
We're having a conversation. What do I know? I'm just a stupid sitcom actor. But I did want to pick your brain about atheism. And I know right now I would call you kind of a spiritual atheist. Is such a thing possible? Can one be a spiritual atheist?
Sure.
How would that work?
I'm never quite sure what someone means by spiritual. Like, do you mean like has a spirit or believes that?
An atheist that incorporates kind of transcendent emotions into a larger kind of heart-based compassion.
I would say
into their belief structure and way of living.
I leave room for it. I don't believe in anything transcendent of the material, but I haven't ruled it out, and I'm not a materialist in the sense of saying there is only the material.
Are you now considering yourself an agnostic?
Yeah, I think that's
is that a cop-out? A lot of people would say, Sebastian Junger came on the show and he's like, it's a bullshit cop-out. You're either an atheist or you're a theist. Of course there's an agnostic. We can't know anything. We can't know any truth. What do you think?
Cognitive science has shown for decades that belief isn't purely rational. Daniel Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2, thinking proves that most decisions start with fast, emotional instincts, and then we rationalize them afterward. Religious faith works the same way. It appeals to feelings of comfort and belonging. Neuroscience studies even show that prayer and worship activate the brain's reward system, releasing dopamine, which reinforces belief whether or not it's true. History backs this up too. Christianity itself absorbed myths and customs from earlier religions. Christmas falls near the Roman festival of Saturnalia, and the story of a dying and rising savior parallels older myths like Osiris and Mithras. Even within the Bible, contradictions reveal human authors, not divine truth. The Gospels can't agree on Jesus' genealogy, Matthew 1 versus Luke 3. Luke 3, or what happened at the resurrection. So Alex is right. Our worldviews aren't cold logic. They're shaped by emotional and cultural forces. That's why Christianity spread, not because it proved God exists, but because it resonated with human psychology and borrowed from traditions that came before. Once you see that, its clear belief is about human needs, not divine truth.
Well, I've heard people say that, and usually it's an atheist of the type of Christopher Hitchens who wants to say that, agnostics are just atheists without a backbone or something. It's like, okay, man, I still don't know if God exists. Like, that is just true. I don't know. It would be maybe a cop-out if I was intentionally, like, calling myself one just for, like, better PR or something. But if anything, it has the opposite effect because I get a lot of flack for not being too, firm in a position. As I like to say, I will die on this fence. I think it is the most reasonable position to hold, especially because there are so many levels to agnosticism. It's like, okay, is it that you don't know? Is it that you think that it's unknowable? Because it could be that, like, I'm agnostic about whether it's raining outside, but I believe we could go and find out with a little bit of effort if it's raining outside. But there's a kind of agnosticism which says you can't know, right? So I could be an agnostic in the sense, like, my some random uncle of mine or something who's never really thought about theology would probably say, if I were to ask, like, yeah, I guess I'm an agnostic, I don't know. But that's just because, I haven't looked at the arguments. If I have a look, I'll figure it out. There are others who have studied all of the arguments, still say they're agnostic, but because they think you won't be able to get to an answer, right? And that's it's a difference saying, I just don't know and I can't know. But there's also an agnosticism that comes about as not knowing what someone's talking about. Do you believe in God? I was like, what do you mean by God? What do you mean by God? Really? It's that annoying Petersonian question, but you need to know. The classical, like, Thomist philosophers will say that God is being itself. God is just being. What the hell does it mean to say that being doesn't exist? What does that even mean? It's like a contradiction. But if you think that God is just being, then you could, as an atheist, be like, yeah, okay, well, I believe that stuff exists, and I guess that makes me a pantheist or something. And it all starts getting muddy and confused.
Sure.
So it's like, okay.
We talked about this before in the limitations of language.
Yeah, it's like ask me, like, define the thing you want to know if I believe in, and ask me if I believe in it, and I will tell you to the best of my ability whether I can or I can't. But if somebody says that agnosticism is just a cop-out, well, I think that's a rhetorical cop-out. I think they're just sort of saying something that's a bit sort of spicy and fun and makes you sound like an edgy atheist, but is actually indicative of either not understanding or purposefully misrepresenting the position of the agnostic.
Now, you said before that you don't believe in anything beyond the material. And in our previous conversation, I described kind of my definition of God as being much more akin to something like beauty or truth or even love. Have you ever been in love?
Yeah.
You've been in love. You've felt deep love for a partner, a romantic partner?
Yeah.
And have you felt it for a family member?
Yeah. I mean, one always wants to say, I think so, because I imagine that, for example, when you have a child
for the
first
so.
time, and
You-
yeah, that's the problem, isn't it?
Okay.
But I can kind of imagine
think that you have felt love, but you don't know that you've felt it on the kind of a level of, like, having a child or something like that.
That's what I mean. It's like, I'm sure that when you have a child, it
changes the paradigm.
I had a
does.
Christian friend who recently had a child and said that having a child made them suddenly understand not the sacrifice of Jesus as sacrificing himself, but the sacrifice of the Father sacrificing his only son. He was like, I've just unlocked this whole new understanding of what it means to love a son that you've
I had a
forgotten.
new understanding of God and the divine when I had a child. I didn't have it. My wife had it, and my wife and my child almost died in childbirth. And it was a horrific story, and it was in the middle of the night and in a hallway in the emergency room in a hospital in Van Nuys, California. It was utter childbirth nightmare that I wouldn't wish on anyone. Everyone survived. It came out great. And I held my son in one of the most profound moments of my life in this hallway at 4 a.m., having him almost die and being brought back from death. And there I was, and I looked him in the eyes, and I felt a kind of love on a level that I had never experienced before. And it made me understand God in a different way, because the idea of a judgmental God, a punishing God, a God that is scowling and looking down on us and keeping little marks of what we've done wrong, and that if someone sins or errs, they're going to be cast out or punished or smited or sent to hell or something like that, becomes preposterous.
Yeah.
Because when you love this child so much, of course there are consequences to behaviors. When my son did some nefarious activities here and there in his teenage years, there were consequences to it. But the love never wavered. And the idea of some kind of like undying punishment from me to this beautiful little creature that had come into the world was beyond the possibility. And then I'm just a unemployed sitcom actor with a mediocre podcast. What do I know? Let alone the divine being, Father, creator of love itself. How much love, how much intimacy, closeness, and light does this, this essence hold us all? The idea of like some kind of punishment or smiting then just becomes ludicrous. So it did, for me, shift my perspective of the divine. Does that make sense?
And there are things which experience gives you that you just can't quite put into words. I mean, William James famously tried to sort of analyze what religious experience is, and he comes up with these, I think there are like 4 qualities, and one of the qualities of religious experience is its ineffability, that you cannot put it into words, that you can't explain it. It's something that you literally just can't explain. It's like taking psychedelics, right? If you take psychedelics and you try to explain what it's like, you can kind of get halfway there, but there is a kind of knowledge that consists in experience.
I heard in an interview that you did, and I was listening to a clip of it, and you were talking about like, imagine someone trying to write an essay about the color blue.
Yeah.
You could know a little bit. It could give you some clues into the color blue, but if you'd never seen color before and you grew up in a gray room or you were colorblind or whatever, and all of a sudden you had access to color, seeing the color blue is a very different experience than reading about the color blue.
Yeah, this is a thought experiment called Mary's Room. So you imagine Mary in this room, but you can make it even worse, because you can say, imagine that Mary in this black and white room that she's born in has access to everything that ever even could be written or uncovered or understood about the color blue. All the science that we're yet to discover, all the color theory, everything that could even be known. She has it all written down, she studies it all. And then she steps outside and she sees something blue. The question is, does she learn something? And it seems like the answer is yes. And if that's the case, then there is a kind of knowledge that consists in experience.
When Alex says he'll die on the fence as an agnostic, he's actually pointing to one of the strongest philosophical positions. We don't know, and maybe we can't know. Even Thomas Huxley, who coined the term agnostic in the 19th century, argued that intellectual honesty requires admitting limits to human knowledge. Science supports this. The Mary's Room thought experiment in philosophy of mind shows that no matter how much you know about an experience, you can't fully understand it without living it. That doesn't mean the supernatural is real. It just means human brains process knowledge differently when tied to emotion and perception, and religious experiences don't prove a God. Neuroscience shows that love, awe, and mystical states all arise from brain activity. Experiments with psychedelics like psilocybin reliably trigger feelings of unity, transcendence, or divine presence, the same sensations people attribute to God. In fact, Andrew Newberg's brain scans of praying nuns and meditating monks revealed predictable neurological patterns, not evidence of heaven. Even the Bible contradicts the idea of an all-loving God revealed through experience. Exodus 34:7 describes God punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. Compare that to Jesus' teaching of unconditional forgiveness, and you see human authors projecting different experiences of love, fear, and control, not a consistent divine truth.
And that is best.
And love is like that.
And that points us to love, because I think that love is the greatest kind of analogy to God. And you said, I don't believe in anything kind of transcendent beyond the material. Do you believe that love is merely kind of neurons and endorphins in the brain united with some kind of DNA kind of like impetus towards propagation of the species?
Now, that's a genuine mystery, because I think that's tied up to the question of consciousness more broadly. I don't have any problem saying that the experience of love is something like a feeling. It's something that you very strongly feel. And so if you're going to be a materialist about consciousness in general, you can say that love is just one of those feelings that is neurons in the brain. But not specific to love, just specific to feeling anything. I find it very strange to say that not that the feeling of love or the seeing of blue is correlated with brain activity, but that is the brain activity. That love is the same thing as the neurons firing in my brain when I feel love. I'm not interested in what the brain's doing. I'm interested in the experience that correlates with that brain activity. If the experience of seeing blue is just neurons firing in my brain, if that's what blue is, I should be able to cut open your brain and find blue in there somewhere, but you can't. There's something called blue, this experience that you have, which goes alongside the brain activity, but is not the same thing as it.
Mm-hmm.
That is the greatest mystery for materialists to explain, which is why I'm agnostic. That's why I say I leave room for this. I don't say I'm a materialist. The biggest challenge for that is consciousness.
Well, one of the biggest disservices that atheists, I feel, do to themselves and to their cause, because atheists can be extremely evangelical, is this idea that consciousness is an illusion. It's the Daniel Dennett kind of thing. Like we're getting all of these inputs, and our brain makes them become a totality of experience, but it's all illusory, including emotion. And that free will is also an illusion, but that, between our DNA and between our neurons firing and our background and our B.F. Skinner kind of behavioralist way that we've grown up in our culture, any choice that we're seeming to make has actually been pre-wired into our cognition. But if atheists hold to consciousness is an illusion and there's no such thing as free will, you're not going to gain a lot of converts. Because if you go to a random house over here in Thousand Oaks, California.
Have you heard the bad news?
Like, hey, by the way, guys, your experience of being a human being, memories and growing up and falling in love and breaking your leg and losing your uncle and seeing the Mona Lisa for the first time. By the way, that's all an illusion.
Yeah.
And in fact, you didn't even really experience that. And you didn't even choose to go to Italy and go see the Mona Lisa. That was all chosen for you in a variety of different ways. You're not really doing yourselves any favor by gaining people over to the atheist bandwagon.
The few issues I'd have to raise to that, though, are firstly that truth doesn't have to be palatable, right? If it is actually the case, you might not have many converts to it, but if it is the case, then it just is the case. Also, some people will say that
Christians would say the same thing.
That's true, but that's the thing.
Burning in hell may not be palatable,
but it
doesn't
what you
convert
need to hear,
people,
right?
but it's true.
And so I think, the kind of atheist materialists you're talking about would say the same thing. Technically speaking, you don't have to be a materialist to be an atheist, because atheism is being without God.
Yep.
You could believe that there's an immaterial existence. You could believe in mind-body dualism, but not believe that there's a God, for example. That's another important thing to spell out. But yeah, I mean, the idea that consciousness is an illusion, I think, is pretty confused. Having said that, I haven't thought about this as much as Daniel Dennett has, so I have to temper my words. But I really think that that's almost a contradiction in terms. There's also another sort of element that's missing from this picture. We talk about there only being the material, or there being the material, but also this like mind stuff. This immaterial thing. There's also a position that there's only the mind stuff and that the material doesn't exist.
Oh, that's good. I know my friend Stephen Phelps is out there watching, and he's all in favor of that.
Yeah.
Right? You lit up like a Christmas tree. He's so happy right now.
So they call it idealism, at least in one of its forms.
Okay, I hadn't heard of that.
So it's kind of mysterious how materialists account for consciousness, but they say, like, in some way, the conscious experience is just emergent of material properties. And the idealist says that the material world is emergent of a mind. So George Berkeley is sort of the classic philosopher to think about here. He starts by sort of asking the reader to be like, it's impossible to separate the thing from your idea of the thing, right? Like if you try to imagine a tree that's just on its own somewhere in a forest, you've got the concept in your mind. The thing that's in your mind is the concept of the tree. It's not you don't have a material tree in your mind. It's the concept. And like your sense experience, you're only seeing a representation of what's in front of you.
Is that kind of like Plato's forms, like the ideal form?
Plato is sort of abstracting from objects to understand why this is a cup and that's also a cup. What is it they have in common? They're far apart from each other. They're different colors. They're different shapes. What is it they have in common? Well, they both share in this abstract thing called a form. That's a whole other thing, which I also think kind of maybe points to consciousness, but that's really interesting. But no, Berkeley is talking about you can't think of a thing without thinking of the thing, right? Nothing exists except insofar as it's being thought about. Now, I think there are so many holes to poke in this, but this is Berkeley's position. So he's like, When you see a table, you're just seeing your mind's representation of the table. You don't see the table directly. Same thing like Kant points out, you don't have direct access to the table. It's through your experience. Okay, well, the same thing with anything, and the critic says, well, I can conceive of a cup just existing on its own. And Berkeley's like, yeah, but you're conceiving of it. And so what you're imagining is a thought. So here comes the objection to this position. Aha, okay, well, Mr. Berkeley, if I have a candle and I light the candle and I look at it and then I leave the room and I don't think about it, no one's thinking about the candle, and yet I come back and the candle has melted. There must have been a time in between where the candle existed, but no one was thinking about it. So it existed separate from thought. And Berkeley says, I still think that things only exist insofar as they're being thought about. But what you've just proven is that there is always some kind of mind thinking about everything all at once.
Ooh.
And that's what God is for George Berkeley.
Interesting.
So Berkeley thinks that God exists and the entire material universe is like a thought of God, which is kind of interesting. The Plato's form thing is interesting because there is this great mystery. Why is this a cup? Why is that a cup? Why is this a table and this not a table? It's actually a really difficult question to answer.
When people say love proves God, they're confusing emotion with evidence. Neuroscience is clear. Love is a product of brain chemistry. Oxytocin, dopamine, and vasopressin drive bonding between partners, parents, and children. These chemicals evolved to help humans survive and pass on their genes, not to reveal the divine. The fact that we feel love so powerfully doesn't mean it comes from outside the material. It means our brains are wired for it. Consciousness is often called the hard problem, but that mystery doesn't point to God either. Philosophers like Daniel Dennett and Patricia Churchland argue that consciousness emerges from complex neural networks, just like flight emerges from wings. We don't need a supernatural soul to explain experience. And history shows that claims about consciousness as proof of God shift with time. Augustine said it was the soul. Descartes said it was dualism. Today, neuroscience shows its electrochemical activity. Each step shrinks the role of God. Even Berkeley's idea that the universe only exists because God is thinking it falls apart. Physics shows the universe operated for billions of years before humans, or any minds, were here to perceive it. Cosmic background radiation, fossil records, and planetary evolution all prove that matter existed long before thought. So love, consciousness, and philosophy don't point to God. They point to the complexity of the human brain. The beauty of agnosticism and atheism is that it allows us to admit what we don't yet know without inventing a supernatural answer. What do you think? Does love prove God? Or is it just chemistry and evolution? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this gave you perspective, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into philosophy, science, and belief.
Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only three explanations for the accounts of the resurrection: that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. It seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again, the earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ.
Let's start by the resurrection, because I didn't really get to touch on that much in my last rebuttal. You mentioned that the earliest gospel doesn't have any resurrection appearances, and as you acknowledged,
yes.
It says in Mark 16, the angels tell the disciples to go and tells the woman to go tell the disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So there is a implication that there's going to be appearances. Also, 1 Corinthians 15, which is an earlier account, does mention more appearances than any of the Gospels.
500.
Yeah.
Of course,
I've always found that quite strange, the reference by Paul there to the appearance to more than 500. This is, I believe, the only account of such an event happening. I wonder kind of who these 500 are, if they ever thought to write anything down, if there's any other account of 500 people having seen this kind of stuff. We're not sure why it is that Paul knows this is the case. He doesn't give an account of where he got this information. It seems to me at least plausibly something that could be false, right? It's not, in other words, it's not like extremely well established that Jesus did appear to a group of 500 people.
No, I agree with you. That I don't think the appearance of the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15 is a strong evidential value. It's not a major line of argument for me. I'm just challenging your assertion that there's this a developmental trajectory.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, which is fine, of course. You recognise that does exist within the Gospels. The only exception being here one reference by Paul in a letter, which, of course, we've got kind of no actual narration of the appearance. We've just got somebody saying that he's essentially heard that this is something that Jesus had done. Our earliest accounts of an actual narration of Jesus appearing to people don't exist in our earlier sources, except, of course, to the appearance to Paul on the road to Damascus, which would be an example of a group hallucination. But funnily enough, I find this quite interesting, is that it's often said that, well, the disciples couldn't have been essentially hallucinating because of the fact of group appearances. You don't get group hallucinations. But the only early account that we have of a group hallucination, that is the appearance to Paul and his traveling companions, is one in which the companions don't also see the appearance. It's just Paul, which I find quite strange. So I'm dubious of
But
this.
they do have sensory perceptions of the encounter. But be that as it may, I do want to ask about, because coming back to your developmental scenario, Mark, we don't know what he would have gone on to say, because he finishes his account very abruptly. Scholars debate over whether Mark is complete. He intended to finish there, or whether he actually had an ending that subsequently got lost from verse 9 and following. So we don't really know what Mark would have said. And then Matthew and Luke are written approximately around the same time, and Luke doesn't seem to be literally dependent upon Matthew. So really your only data points are Matthew and Luke and John in terms of your developmental trajectory.
Sure, but of course the lack of the appearance narrative in Mark is part of that trajectory. Of course, this could be explained partly by that trajectory, or perhaps by the fact that he did write it and it got lost, or he just decided not to write it, of course. But I'm just kind of using the evidence that's being presented to me here, which are 4 Gospels, the first of which contains no resurrection appearances. And I'm thinking, what might explain the fact that as time goes on, the fancifulness of the stories seems to increase. Indeed, ending in John, the final edition, with the addition of doubting Thomas, which seems to be a moral lesson against requiring evidence for belief. Of course, after Thomas touches the wounds of Jesus, Jesus says that it's, he now believes, but blessed are those who believe without seeing. He believes because he's seen. Blessed are those who believe without seeing. So what we get is, the further away we get from the actual events that are being reported, the more fanciful the stories, culminating in a story that has a moral lesson advising people that they shouldn't desire to believe on the basis of evidence. This seems to me strange.
So that's not what John's saying there at all. In fact, in the very same chapter, he goes on to say, John, the author, goes on to say that these things are written that you might believe that he is the Christ and thus have life in his name. In terms of what he says in verse 29 to Thomas, he's chiding Thomas for not having believed in sufficient evidence, because he had the testimony of the other apostles. He'd been with Jesus throughout his ministry and observed the miracles and so forth.
Of course, John is writing at the end of John why he wrote his gospel, but I'm quoting the words of Jesus, right? So there's kind of there's a disanalogy here, or a difference here, which is that Jesus is saying, you believe because you've seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. It's then John who says, oh, but I decided to write this down so that people will come to believe. That it's kind of 2 separate sources there.
Sure. So, first of all, I gave an explanation for an interpretation of what I think Jesus is saying. And secondly, Jesus, if you look elsewhere, for example, in Matthew 11, when John the Baptist sends disciples to Jesus, are we the one we're expecting, or should we wait for another? He says, well, go back to John, tell him what you hear and see. And he talks about the miracles that he's been performing. Right? He talks about the sign of Jonah and his resurrection as being evidence for his incarnation and divine identity.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Is there like a question?
Yeah, so I'm objecting to that particular point, that Jesus does seem to affirm approaching this topic evidentially.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. That would be fine. I'd be fine to just kind of drop that point about John, but I'm not really sure if we should.
Okay.
It seems to me that seems to be the most natural reading of doubting Thomas. You're saying that the story should in fact be interpreted as Jesus basically saying, you have believed because you've seen a lot of evidence. Blessed are those who believe having seen sufficient evidence, or something like this.
Yeah, so Thomas was discontent with having sufficient evidence, that he should have believed on the basis of what he already had. And God doesn't take well to people not believing when they've already got sufficient evidence.
Right, I see. That might be plausible. I'm happy to look into it.
The earliest gospel we have, Mark, ends with no appearances of the risen Jesus, just women told he will be seen in Galilee, and they flee in fear, Mark 16:1-8. The later long ending with appearances, Mark 16:9-20, is a known later addition, not in our earliest manuscripts. Then, as time passes, later Gospels add fuller stories, Matthew and Luke, circa 80 to 90 CE, and finally John circa 90 to 110 CE, which is exactly the kind of legendary growth historians expect. Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15, written in the 50s CE, says Jesus appeared to more than 500, but gives no names, place, or narrative, and no other source reports it. Paul also never met Jesus in life and says he received this tradition, so we can't treat it as checked eyewitness history, 1 Corinthians 15:3-8. Claims that groups don't hallucinate, overlook what psychology shows. Grief and expectancy can produce vivid experiences. Studies find 30 to 60% of bereaved people report seeing or sensing a loved one. Memory conformity then spreads and reshapes stories. Even Acts' accounts of Paul's conversion show his companions didn't share his vision, Acts 9:7, 22:9, which matches an internal, personal experience. John's Doubting Thomas ends with, "Blessed are those who have not seen," John 20:29, and the author says he wrote so readers would believe, John 20:31. That's faith-forward theology, not verifiable history. On balance, the earliest evidence fits developing tradition and visionary experiences, not a confirmed physical resurrection.
I did want to ask you, though, about your low intrinsic probability of miracles.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So, can you justify why you come to that conclusion?
I guess the point that I was kind of trying to make there was to say that in the context of this discussion, do you expect a naturalist to take as seriously the hypothesis that a man rose from the dead as he should take the hypothesis that, say, Jesus didn't die or something? Like, in other words, like, I suppose you're not surprised that somebody would not do that, but you're saying that they're being kind of irrational in doing so.
Correct.
Because in assuming that something like a miracle would have a lower intrinsic probability.
Exactly. So I'm interested in what your justification is for assigning such an intrinsically low probability to miracles.
Wouldn't you say, like as you said, the fact that this doesn't happen elsewhere would not be a good response, because that's what we'd actually want. This is
that's what
God
you'd expect.
Is trying to do. He's trying to put forward a unique event. Could not the same be said that the reason why the resurrection is a powerful vindication of Jesus' message is because it has a low probability of occurring, and so that makes it miraculous that God did it, right? Like, it seems to me that the intuitive force of saying, isn't it amazing that Jesus rising from the dead, isn't it amazing that happened and this vindicates its message, is because of the fact that we should expect this to be so improbable that if it really did happen, this provides strong evidence. And I also wonder if you think that it would provide the same evidence as any other miracle. That is, I don't know why it is that rising from the dead specifically, except maybe the fact that he predicted it, would be any more of an indication of his divinity than his ability to turn water into wine. If there was an instance of him having predicted that he would go on to do that and then did that, this seems equally miraculous. This is I don't see why the resurrection in particular would offer a vindication.
Sure. So for a number. Okay, so I'm trying to formulate a question. So Isaiah 53:10, for example, speaks about the resurrection in the context of messianic prophecy. Jesus himself says that the resurrection will be the vindication of his messianic divine self-claims. And so it's very surprising if God raises Jesus from the dead if he's a false Messiah, for example, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense.
Yeah.
I think that answers it quite well, I think.
And would you also be amenable to the argument that you can bring other arguments to bear independently on Jesus' messianic and divine identity, such as some of the arguments I listed briefly, the trilemma, messianic prophecy, the conversion of Paul, etc., that would be relevant to establishing the prior probability in Jesus' case specifically?
I think you could do, but I don't think that it's been very well done. I don't think the examples that you say, like the trilemma, I don't think that's like good evidence of Jesus' divinity, nor do I think the conversion of St. Paul is particularly strong evidence of Jesus' divinity. I wonder I know there's only kind of a minute left of your time, but what are the specificities about Paul's conversion that you think bear on the divinity of Jesus?
Sure. I'm trying to formulate questions. This is my question time, so I'm rather than give a statement.
Well, I can ask
sure.
you when it comes to you. Have anything else you want to say now?
Sure. Okay, so in terms of the argument for intelligent design, would you acknowledge that it's not a God of the gaps argument, that is actually a positive argument?
This is something I was going to ask you about. You said that it's not a God of the gaps argument because it's based on what we do know, and I forget exactly how you argued that case. If you could maybe just do it again briefly.
Yeah, so it's basically that there's a habitual association between information and conscious activity.
Right. Yeah, so I would say, for example, imagine somebody like pre-Newton or something, looking at the orbits of the planets and saying, like, I have absolutely no idea how they're up there, why they're spinning in the way that they're spinning. It must be God. Would you say that is a God of the gaps argument? Mm-hmm. But suppose somebody then said to you, this isn't a God of the gaps argument. This is actually based on what I do know, not what I don't know, which is that there's a habitual association between things that we see moving, that don't stop moving, generally have some kind of agent causing them to continue moving. And so I say that the same thing must be true of the orbs moving in the sky. That doesn't seem to not make it a God of the gaps argument. That seems like just a way of kind of dressing it up.
When we ask how probable a miracle is, start with the base rate. Across billions of human deaths, there are no medically verified cases of a person dead for days returning to normal life. That makes the prior tiny. To overcome a tiny prior, you need multiple, independent, detailed sources written close to the event. Instead, we have anonymous gospels decades later. Mark around 70 CE, Matthew Luke around 80 to 90, John around 90 to 110, and a brief list in Paul without names or locations. Low prior plus weak, late testimony, low posterior probability. Appeals to prophecy don't fix this. The verses Christians cite aren't clear predictions of a Messiah rising on the third day. Psalm 16:10 is about David not being abandoned to Sheol. Hosea 6:2 speaks of Israel's restoration. Isaiah 53:10-11 concerns the servant's vindication, not an explicit personal resurrection. These are theological readings after the fact, not straightforward forecasts fulfilled by data. Paul's conversion also fits known visionary experiences. Acts gives inconsistent details about what his companions perceived. Acts 9, 7 verses. 22-9, which points to literary shaping, and his companions don't share the vision, consistent with an internal event.
That the naturalist will one day be able to explain and account for DNA replication, then that the theist will ever be able to account for suffering or hiddenness. Indeed, it's usually expected that the theist will never be able to offer such an account. Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only three explanations for the accounts of the resurrection: that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. I would add to this suggestion a fourth, which is that the reports themselves were inaccurately put down into our records. But I think Jonathan more or less addressed that by saying that the gospel writers were fairly scrupulous, and so I think implicitly trying to undermine that example. Now, I admit that some of the hypotheses for explaining what happened on Easter morning are a little bit tenuous. There have been theories that have been suggested and generally rejected by certainly most biblical scholars. For example, the idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen. These kinds of things are usually disproved with fairly intuitive points. That is to say, it seems ridiculous to suggest that Jesus didn't die on the cross. The Romans did know how to kill people, after all, and there would have been various other reasons, which I won't go into now for the sake of time, but I'm sure you're familiar with such a response. But you have to understand the context in which this conversation is taking place. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. But doesn't it seem less plausible yet to suggest that a man rose from the dead? to the naturalist, you can understand why this would seem like quite a leap unless you've already assumed theism, making the suggestion that this God might have risen Jesus from the dead more plausible than these other explanations. Thinking about the evidence for the resurrection is a complicated topic, but it seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again. The earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ. What the end of Mark's gospel does say is that, there's essentially a prediction. That is, we're told by an angel or presumed angel, that Jesus has gone ahead to Galilee, and you should expect to find him there. And this is where the original manuscript of Mark's gospel ends. Matthew, the next earliest gospel, does contain two appearances, one to the women who visited the tomb on the way to tell the disciples, and then a vision in line with the prediction made in Mark. Now, of course, if this was being somehow forged or something, it seems quite strange, or at least plausible, that this addition could have been made using Mark as a source, which everyone agrees that Matthew does. Luke, later still, contains even more appearances, including like the road to Emmaus. And then John's Gospel, even later still, provides more accounts of appearances, including doubting Thomas, and some other famous examples. I find it a little strange, then, that the further away we get from the origin of the source, the more appearances we see. The earliest Gospel contains no resurrection appearances. The second earliest Gospel does contain one group appearance, but it's exactly in line with what was predicted at the end of Mark. Anyway, this seems a little strange to me. Now, I won't suggest that I could confidently say that these Gospels were forged, or that the writers were mistaken, or that somebody was lying, or that something got miscommunicated. All I'll say is that for the naturalist, these conclusions seem a lot more plausible than the idea that a man might have risen from the dead. I think that's all I've got time for, but hopefully we can speak about St. Paul in a later stage. Thank you.
When Christians argue there are only three options, disciples lied, were mistaken, or were right, we can point out a fourth, that the stories themselves changed as they were written down. This happens all the time in history. Legends grow, details get reshaped, and later writers add material. We see that in the Gospels. Mark, our earliest source, ends with no appearances. Decades later, Matthew and Luke expand the story with appearances, and John, our latest source, adds even more dramatic scenes like doubting Thomas. The further from the events, the bigger the claims. And there are contradictions. Matthew places Jesus' appearance in Galilee, while Luke keeps it in Jerusalem. The number of women at the tomb, the number of angels, and what exactly happens at the tomb all change from gospel to gospel. This is what you expect if stories are developing, not if they're carefully preserved eyewitness reports. From a naturalistic view, ordinary errors, embellishments, and visions are far more likely than one man breaking the universal biological rule of death. If another religion today offered the same kind of evidence for a miracle, would Christians believe it? What do you think? Is the resurrection better explained by faith tradition than by history? Comment below. Let's discuss. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more.